Right, welcome everyone. Thank you for adjusting to the schedule. We are sorry that the keynote ran long, but really exciting stuff that we had to share with you there. I'm excited to talk about practical cryptography today, but I wanted to give a brief introduction to why I care about this stuff. So does anybody know who this is? I can't really see you. Yes, Alias. So this is Sydney Bristow. This is a very popular TV show circa 2001. It was my favorite TV show of all time. I was on the message boards, which if you know what that is a little sad, but I was very into it. And so Sydney Bristow was a double agent for the CIA, and she used to do all sorts of cool spy stuff. And it was she was my inspiration. I wanted to work for the CIA because of her, because Jennifer Garner was so cool in this role. And they used to go out and solve all these missions and defeat the bad guys and do all this cool crypto stuff. And I had no idea what any of it meant. But basically when I became a freshman in college and I saw that there was an introduction to cryptology course offered, I was yes, that is my path to becoming Sydney Bristow. Little did I know that introduction to cryptology was just a lot of number theory and math. It was not very exciting. I was not cracking codes. I was not doing Da Vinci Code type stuff, but I did learn a lot in that class, and that was kind of my pathway into starting to learn about this. And now I deal with cryptography every day as part of my role at Twilio, and so I wanted to take some of those foundations that I've developed over the last few years and share them with all of you and give you some insight into what it is that we use public key cryptography for. So I'm sorry to report that we're not going to be talking about cryptocurrencies in this talk. So if you came for that, that is not what this talk is about. This talk is about cryptography, which is the study of this stuff. I also want to spend some time on the practical applications, like I mentioned. We're going to talk a little bit about how Twilio uses cryptography under the hood. In all likelihood, most of you in this room probably aren't going to go implement crazy cryptographic systems in your companies, wherever that might be, but I think it's really important to have a brief understanding of how this works, so you know some of the systems that you're dealing with. This talk is also going to outline some of the origins of public key cryptography, what public key cryptography is, and how it works, and then also where you'll find it in the real world. So my name is Kelly Robinson. I work here at Twilio. This is normally where I would explain what Twilio is, but you're at our conference, so I'm going to assume that you know that. But how many of you are users of Authy or have heard of Authy? Great, a few of you, awesome. So Twilio actually acquired Authy a few years ago, so Authy is part of the Twilio products. If you were in the keynote earlier, you saw a great application of how Authy can be used. I'm really excited about all this stuff that we're adding push authentication into securing conversations. But I'm on the developer evangelist team at Twilio, and so I work specifically with the account security products, and so that is both the Authy team and some of our other products like Verify and Lookup that we use to secure customer communications. And cryptography is the underlying foundation for modern authentication, and so that's a big part of why I wanted to understand some of this stuff better. So let's meet Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob are the characters in most every story that we talk about when we talk about cryptography. In this case, they're going to be played by two of my favorite characters, Regina and Gretchen. This is from the movie Mean Girls, in case anybody doesn't get the reference, but if you don't, we can have movie night later too. So Regina and Gretchen, or Alice and Bob, have a history of illicit dealings. We don't really know what they're up to, but they definitely want to pass secret messages to each other all the time. And so in the early days, there was a lot of ways that you can do this. And so high school girls might, figure out some kind of ciphertext that they want to use, and whether that's shifting letters in one direction, replacing letters with numbers, deciding that you're going to replace every fifth letter with the letter X. It could be anything, but you get the idea. There's some kind of predictable cipher that you can use in a way that you can transform the text from plain text into a ciphertext. And both parties would understand this method and be able to encode and decode the message in the same way. And so you can do this by understanding the same cipher on both sides. But the problem is you want to be able to do this without a third party like Eve being able to intercept it. And so you want to be able to make sure that the third party never intercepts the cipher. They don't understand the way that you're doing this. And this can be problematic because if both people are using the same kind of encryption scheme, they might not be able to share the way that they're doing that without first meeting in person or being able to share that information in some kind of other secure way. But this is known as symmetric key cryptography. The same key is used in both directions. And this worked really well for people like World War II spies and high school girls. But that problem enters when you have two people that want to communicate that can't agree on that same cipher in advance. And this was sort of how we got to the point of wanting to come up with a new method. And this is where public key cryptography was born out of. Because you don't want to be able to have that eavesdropper, interceptor be able to get that secret key. And public key cryptography is an incredibly necessary advancement because of the internet. We are now dealing with people all of the time that we've never met. We're sending payments over the internet with people that we don't know. These are companies on the other side of the end, at the other end of the transaction that we haven't had a chance to interact with before. We don't know if they are what they're going to do with that information. So we want to be able to secure those types of communications. So what is public key cryptography? And I want to make sure that you know that public key cryptography and asymmetric crypto, I'm going to use those a little bit interchangeably. And so you have symmetric cryptography and asymmetric cryptography, which are, the two ends of the spectrum. But public key cryptography is also the same thing as asymmetric. So in this case, each entity would have two keys. And I say entity specifically because these keys can be used in a lot of ways, not just between two people. In the payments example, one of the people on one of the ends might be a website or a computer or a machine. So either side of this equation could be a bot or a human or a machine or something, not just a human, has to be on the other end. And so the first key is going to be a public key, and this is something that you can share with other people. And the second key is going to be your private key, and this is going to be kept secret. And you want to make sure that you never share this with people, because if you do, this is one of the ways that you're going to be other people would be able to intercept and be able to read your encrypted messages. And these keys are generated at the same time using an algorithm that is algorithmically linked. And this is an example of how you would do that. And so you create a key pair, and then you can encrypt and decrypt the message using those two different keys. And this is really interesting because you can share the public key and still decrypt with the private key without ever having to risk that message would be intercepted, because even if somebody intercepts the public key, they can't decrypt the message because it's unlikely that they would have access to the private key. We'll talk more about how this works. I do want to mention that for most of this explanation, I'm going to be focusing on the RSA algorithm. I mentioned that those keys are generated at the same time and mathematically linked. When I'm talking about that, I'm going to be talking about the RSA algorithm. We'll introduce some of the other algorithms that can be used for this in a little bit. But for this part of the explanation, we're going to be focusing on how this works with RSA. RSA was invented by three dudes whose last names started with the letters R, S, and A, so don't read too much into what that means. I don't remember what their names were, but it's not really important. So there's two main ways that you can use the RSA algorithm in asymmetric cryptography. And the first case is encrypting with a public key. And so the use case here is going to be if you want to send a message that you don't want anyone else to read. And so in this case, you would have Bob who wants to send a message to Alice. And so Bob would encrypt the message with Alice's public key. And then because he only wants Alice to be able to read that, Alice is the only one with her private key. And so she's the only one that can decrypt that message. The second use case is going to be signing with the private key. And this is going to be a use case where you're verifying the identity of somebody that wrote the original message. And this is very useful in cases of authentication. This is very useful in cases where you want to have that verification happen. And so in this case, what you would do is if Bob wanted to send a message to Alice and wanted to make sure that Alice knew that was from Bob, Bob would sign the message with his private key and send Alice the signature and his public key. And then Alice could decrypt the signature and with Bob's public key and verify that that message came from Bob. You can also combine these two methods together to both send an encrypted message and a signed message, but you would have to use both Bob's key pair and Alice's key pair in order to do that. And so this is what we already saw, the use case of encrypting with a public key. And so you can see there that we're using Bob's public key to encrypt the message, and then Bob's getting the private key, using his private key to then decrypt the message. And in that case, only Bob can decode the ciphertext. Similarly, signing with your private key, you would use Alice's private key to sign the message, you would get the signature, and then Bob can use Alice's public key to validate the signature. So I mentioned the algorithms briefly. These keys are generated with math. The short explanation for that, but I'm going to get into how this works, the principles behind how the RSA algorithm is going to generate the key pairs. So I want you to think about mixing together two paint colors. This is a operation that's really easy to do in one direction, so you can easily mix together two colors of paint. But then if I tell you to unmix those colors of paint back out into their original colors, that's going to be a lot harder. And we see this all the time with things in physical security. And so this is things like zip ties, locks, tamper-proof screws, those ink things that you get on clothing. There's lots of examples of ways that we do this that are really easy to secure in one direction and hard to undo unless you have the key or a special method of undoing it. And it's possible for us to undo these things without detection, but it's hard enough that most people don't take the time or the money to try. And that's important because even if it can be possible, we want to make it difficult enough that people aren't going to try to do this because it's not going to be worth their time. And cryptography relies on the same principle. We call these trapdoor one-way functions. So the idea is it's easy to do in one direction, but hard to undo, and the trapdoor is the out. That's the key in this scenario that allows us to backtrack this and allows us to get the answer we want. But unless you have that key, it's going to be really hard. And so cryptography does this by relying on calculations that are really easy to do in one direction and really hard to reverse. And you can achieve this in digital security by multiplying together two really large prime numbers. So it's easy for the computer to compute the product of two 600-digit prime numbers, but it's really difficult for the computer to take that result and factor it back out into its original factors. So think about this. Which one is easier? If I tell you to find the two prime factors of 4,757, there's a couple ways you could do this. You could write a Python script. You could loop through all of the known prime numbers less than 4,700, and eventually you would find the two prime factors. But even with a Python script, that's possible with a 4-digit product. But after you get into the thousands of digits long type numbers, you're going to have a really hard time. But if I tell you to multiply together 67 and 71, that's a lot easier. You don't have to write a script for that. You can put that into your calculator. You might even be able to do that in your head. And so these are the types of principles in the trapdoor functions that we're using inside of public key cryptography in order to make this work. So let's walk through a very basic example of how to generate a key pair in RSA. We're going to intentionally use very small numbers here. The numbers that we would be using in reality are much, much larger than this, but using 100-digit numbers for the purposes of an example is not very useful. So there's real code for this that I included on my GitHub, and I've included a link to that, and these slides will be posted after if you want to play around with this. So first we have to choose some inputs, and so these are going to be the prime numbers that we're going to be multiplying together, and we're also choosing a public exponent, that is the e equals 37. And then we'll multiply together our prime numbers to get an n, subtract 1 from each of those to get this product of x, and then take the modular multiplicative inverse to get this value of d. And I want to point out that these are all examples of trapdoor functions. So they're easy to do in one direction, but they're going to be really hard to reverse in the other direction. And so this is one of the ways that we start to add these into the public key cryptography algorithm in RSA to make it hard for somebody to undo these types of calculations unless they know P or Q or E. And then once we have all of those values, we have our public and our private key. And those are actually tuples of some of the calculations that we made. And the only thing that we're missing here is the function for inverse mod. That's really only about 15 lines of Python code. My colleague Chris helped me out a lot with this to write the code that would make this actually work. And we'll talk about some of the reasons that you probably don't want to write that code on your own in a little bit. But again, this is for instructional purposes. You can start to see how you can generate these codes yourself. And finally, if you take a message, a simple message like 1, 2, 3, you can then encrypt that message using your public key, and then decrypt the message using your private key, and you get back the same message. And I think that's really, really cool because you can see how you're doing this with two completely different sets of numbers, but you're able to do these multiplications and these calculations in different directions that are able to decrypt and encrypt messages. So let's briefly talk about a couple other common algorithms that you'll see. The first one that I want to mention is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. This one's really cool because you're actually building a shared secret key together. And so you start out with I'm going to walk through this using the paint color example because that's a little bit more illustrative than talking about this one with numbers. But so you'll start out with a common paint color. So this would be kind of like your public key. And so this would be shared, and this would be one of those things that even if the eavesdropper got a hold of this, they wouldn't be able to get that secret key at the end. And then each party, Alice and Bob, would pick their secret paint color, and then they would mix that into their shared paint color. They're never going to tell the other party what their secret paint color is. And then they're going to get their mixture and swap their mixtures. Again, this is an example of a one-way function, because even if an eavesdropper gets a hold of that mixture, they can't really separate it to get to the primary secret paint color. And then once they have that mixture, they're going to mix back in their original secret paint color, and at the end, they end up with a shared secret key. And I think that is a really cool way to do this. This is something that's a little slow to do, and so this is not going to be done on like every web transaction that you would be doing. But one of the ways that you can do this is do this once, and then you have a shared secret key, and it turns out encrypting and decrypting things with symmetric key cryptography is a lot faster. So one of the ways that this is applied in reality is that people will do the asymmetric cryptography to actually share secret keys, symmetric keys rather. And then you'll use the symmetric keys to do a lot of the encryption down the line, but you share those in a way that's really hard, or it's you're a lot more confident that people aren't going to intercept that. The next one that I want to talk about is elliptic curve cryptography. And this one works in a weird way. So you basically pick a couple points on this curve. I've included the elliptic curve equation there. You pick some points on the curve, and then you bounce around the curve to different points in a predictable way, a certain number of times. And in order to do that, you're using that one-way function because you end up with a point on the curve that's really hard to backtrack what those other predictable inputs into your function were. And so this is another way that you can use public key cryptography to generate a public and private key pair without somebody being able to take the result and backtrack it out into the public and private key. So elliptic curve cryptography is gaining more traction recently. It's very popular right now because this is what Bitcoin uses. And so there's a lot of people that are like cryptocurrency enthusiasts that are really into elliptic curve cryptography. It isn't used as widely as something like RSA, mostly because it's newer. There were also some vulnerabilities found in it a few years ago. Or vulnerabilities rather, there was an NSA backdoor that was found in it a few years ago. It's just harder to implement than RSA. And so one of the reasons that people aren't using it as much is because there's not as much library support out there for doing this in your own applications. And so let's talk about key size, because this is an important factor into the equations that we use to generate our key pairs. And so in this example from XKCD, we see that they're talking about a key size of 4096 bits. The joke here being that a crypto enthusiast would say like 4096 bits is a very secure key size. Key size impacts the overall security of the algorithm and the keys that we're using. And so the joke being that crypto enthusiasts here would think that this is, great. There's no way that anybody's ever going to break into their computer. Of course, that's not how it works in reality. You just hit somebody over the head with a wrench and make them give them your password. But key sizes in different algorithms produce different security strengths. And you can see here that the smaller key size in ECC actually produces the same security strength as something with RSA. And so this is one of the reasons that you might see ECC elliptic curves taking over in the future, is because you can get the same level of security strength with smaller keys. And smaller keys are generally faster to pass around. You can think about doing this in web transactions or in any kind of digital transactions. If you're doing hundreds or thousands of these, a second, this is something that's going to add up, and the incremental speed gains are going to be important. So the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a US governing body that kind of provides guidance on these things, right now they're recommending a security strength of at least 112 bits of security. But that's, they're pretty conservative estimates, but they do say that if you want your keys to be secure past, I think it's 2030, that you want to make sure that your key strength is at least 128 bits of security. And so they say that for RSA, you want to have 3072 bits key sizes for RSA, and that would equate to 256-bit ECC keys. These advancements are because basically, advancements in hardware and computational power would make it easier for people to break these codes. And so security strength in the bits of security is basically a measurement of how likely it is that somebody could break into your system. It's a measure of how much strength it would take. And so it's basically the amount of work that somebody would have to go through in order to break through your algorithm and cover the entire key space. And this is going to take a lot of computing power, a lot of memory. It's really unlikely that anybody has the power to do that with something like a 3072-bit RSA key right now. But they're conservative in saying maybe by 2030 people will figure this out. I briefly want to talk about how you would do something like public key cryptography in a language like Python. There are libraries that you can use for this, but I point this out because I like the cryptography library because it separates things into things that are like safe to do, things that you can use that you probably won't screw up. And then they have this hazmat section that I think is really interesting because these are some of the primitives that are like, be careful, only use this if you know what you're doing. 100% sure because this module is full of landmines and dragons and dinosaurs with laser guns. And so this is one of those examples of like things that you should probably use other libraries for this and like other tools that are doing this when you need it, because doing this yourself can be dangerous. And I think that there's this maybe gains some respect for the people that do this well, and also like gives us some empathy for the people that end up building things like this with vulnerabilities in them. And so you don't want to be that person. You don't want to build the vulnerable security solution. So just be careful if this is something that you have to implement securely. Make sure that you have a team of people that is willing to do the due diligence to make sure that this is something that you can absolutely secure. So I want to talk about everyday uses of public key cryptography. These are just a few examples of where we see it in the real world. And so TLS, which is the protocol behind HTTPS, this is how we're able to accept secure credit card payments over the internet. If you browsers are taking a lot of UX considerations to make this more obvious to people now, and so I think Chrome is actually making it, they changed their UI so that it will show if a website is not secure instead of showing the lock to indicate that it is secure. And so that's a good indication. If you're ever on a website that is not HTTPS and you're trying to submit a credit card payment, you probably shouldn't do that because what's going to happen is that your credit card information is going to be sent in plain text. Whereas if it's over a secure connection, that will be an encrypted message. This is an example of like an end-to-end encrypted message. Bitcoin uses this, SSH if you're going to log into a server, end-to-end encrypted chat like PGP and GPG, which are protocols for using public key cryptography and communications use this. And my personal favorite, the Authy app, uses public key cryptography. And so if you were in the keynote, you saw an example of push notifications when the agent wanted to authenticate Al in the Flex instance. And so this is an example of how you would do that. And this is using public key cryptography under the hood. And so the push authentication is a great example of this. And one of the reasons that this is the most secure form of 2FA. So for every site that you enable on Authy, for every contact center, or for every app that you want to enable this for, your device generates a new RSA key pair on your device. It then sends the public key to the Authy servers. And this is fine because the Authy servers will store this securely. But even if that gets intercepted in transit, the hacker or whoever would intercept it wouldn't have access to the private key because you're keeping that on your device. That private key remains on your device, and that's one of the ways that you can identify that the device belongs to you. And then when you approve or deny that request, what's happening is your device signs that request with your private key, authenticating that that request came from you. And so this is really cool because then you can say, hey, I know for a fact that this request came from Kelly because she was the one that sent this. She signed it with her private key. I know what message to expect on the other end. I'm also sending the signature. I can validate that the message wasn't changed in transit. I can do all of this validation on top of that signature to make sure that I'm getting back the request that I expect to get. And if I get back anything else, I'm not going to let her through. Another way that Twilio uses this is with our public key client validation. This is an alternative available for enterprise accounts that uses public key cryptography to authenticate API requests. And so you would generate an RSA key pair for this request, submit the public key to the Authy servers, and so you're starting to see the pattern of how this would work. And then when you generate a request, you're generating a JOT token, and then you can include that in the header to sign your requests. And this is an alternative to what we use generally, which is a symmetric key, and that's the username and password method or auth token and account SID that you would use to sign most of your Twilio API requests. Similarly, who here has set up an account on GitHub? A lot of people, and so this is something that like a lot of developers have done. If you've ever set up your GitHub account to accept SSH Git pushes, you've been using public key cryptography for that, and so you do this basically every time you set up a new device. So you might not remember doing this recently, but you might like see this and you're like, oh yeah, I like have to do that. That's the thing where I go to GitHub and they make me like submit that key. And so there's some interesting things about this, and so you're using the SSH keygen algorithm here. And so this is something that comes standard on Unix systems and also is available in the Git bash for Windows. And so they basically provide this command line tool for generating RSA key pairs. It's telling you they want you to use the RSA algorithm. They're also telling you which key size to use. And so GitHub wants to be very secure. They're telling you to use a 4096-bit key. And so there's some interesting examples of how you're using public key there. And then the same thing happens when you push a piece of code to GitHub. They're authenticating you by signing that request to make sure that that's coming from you. And so that's how, if there's any restrictions with the type of accounts that you're pushing code to, you want to make sure that you have write access there, that you're allowed to make those changes and push a new branch or a commit or whatever it is. They're authenticating that that came from you and that you have those permissions to do that, and otherwise it will reject you. One more example that I want to talk about is PGP, which actually stands for Pretty Good Privacy. I thought that was kind of funny. So this is how Keybase validates that I'm in control of my personal website. This is a piece of text that they told me to put in a text file on my personal website to validate that that website belongs to me. So this is live. You can go to this file on my personal website. And there's some interesting pieces of information in here that I'll highlight. And so it says, I have this public key, and it gives the public key in plain text because I wanted to share that. And it also says I am signing this object. And then it takes this object that I'm signing, and so I can use that to validate the signature. By signing that object, I yield a signature of this encrypted piece of text, and so that's my signature. And then with my public key, somebody can validate that that object and my signature came from me. So the best applications of these concepts are basically when developers don't really have to think about how they're used. PGP gets a lot of crap because it's like notoriously hard to use. With that example from Keybase that I just showed you, if I even told you that like, now you have my public key and my signature and the object that I was signing, if I told you to go like, validate that that came from me, you would all be like, yeah, cool, whatever, Kelly, like, I believe you. So PGP also had like a lot of insecurities recently. There was like a pretty big vulnerability that was discovered with it. So, I think there's definitely applications of this stuff that are super useful in everyday life. Like TLS is a great example of that. Like nobody really thinks about how that works. We just kind of trust that it does. Authy is another great example of that. Like it is a very secure form of authentication, but like you didn't really have to do a ton of stuff to set that up. Even like the GitHub method and like the public key client validation method of authenticating web requests and that kind of thing are pretty good because it's a one-time setup thing that you have to do. And applications like Keybase are trying to make this easier for PGP because they're handling all of that validation for you and not making you do it at the end of the day. But I think this is like an interesting thing to think about in the way that people are authenticating different requests. Like I mentioned, because these things are very fragile. Be careful if you're implementing this yourself. Don't roll your own crypto. Use well-accepted encryption schemes like RSA. You don't want to like try to be clever and come up with your own encryption scheme. Like that would be pretty cool, but like do that as a side project. Don't put it in anything important. So these slides will be on my Twitter, like I talked about. If you are interested in this stuff, and like I know I went through a lot of that like very quickly. I wrote a blog post about this that walks through step by step a lot of the same things and provides a lot of links, including links to the code samples and all that stuff that you can go play around with, further reading if you want to go check that out. This is available on the Twilio blog. And then for something fun, I do want to call out this podcast. And so does anybody know this story, the Tamam Shud story, the Somerton Man? This is there's like two people there. It's a really cool story. It's like crazy. So basically in like the 1940s Australia, there was this guy that was found dead on a beach. And they never figured out who he was. This guy, like, this story has everything. It's like unsolved murder, illicit affairs. There's like weird family connections that happen at the end. There's Russian spy theories. But like my favorite part about this is that there was a small piece of paper that was found in this guy's pocket that had a piece of encrypted text on it. And to this day, nobody has been able to decrypt this message. So now that you're all cryptography experts, maybe that could be you. So check out this podcast. It does a really great in-depth storytelling about this case. Even if you don't want to go solve the mystery, definitely a great listen, use of your time. Come find me after this if you have any questions. I'm going to be around Signal Direct the next few days. Those are my contact information if you want to reach out. Once again, my name is Kelly Robinson, and thank you for listening.